Mhm. And do you think that perhaps one of the reasons why sociology is particularly affected by this kind of approach that people have to science or to studying, in this case, society and politics and so on, is because of the object of study of sociology is society and the way people interact with one another, and that leads very easily to politics. And because most sociologists lean a lot toward the left or the far left, that when they work in this field and when they do their studies, they already have sort of a political agenda in their minds, and they already have the conclusions in their head that the study should lead to, and that's why they still adhere also to these outdated sociological theories from the 19th century and so on.
Yes, I think it doesn't make. I think logically, there's no reason that that sociologists need to be on the left or exclusively on the left, and even historically, it can seem kind of odd, but it's the way that it has ended up. And I think I'll also remember too, it's the case with other social sciences, not to the same degree, but I mean, social psychologists are almost always all on the left too. They're less likely to be on the extreme left, I think, right? Like, but they're liberals, you know, on the left of American politics. But I think, but if we look at somebody like Durkheim, who also considered one of the classical sociologists, you know, it's he's drawing from a lot of conservative thought. So this is something that you know, some sociologists have written about, like Robert Nisbet was a sociologist who was politically conservative, but he wrote, he argued that sociology was, in a way, the early sociology of the late 19th century was actually kind of a combination of conservative and liberal ideas at the time. That they were actually obviously using a liberal framework in looking at human society scientifically, right, rather than just drawing from tradition. Right, the idea, this was the Enlightenment framework. We can look at things and use reason and empirical evidence and sort of to understand things. But they also had rejected the individualism of the Enlightenment, in the sense that they saw as important to societies and, you know, and important to understanding how societies work, the same things that conservatives saw as important. So the conservatives who were reacting to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, to these things, at the conservatives at the time, right? Modern American conservatives are often very individualistic, right? But but this kind of this European conservatism, as there was a reaction to the Enlightenment, was appealing to authority, right? Tradition, religion, and the sacred, and all these kind of things. Like they thought that you couldn't just you know, rejecting the notion of the social contract, right? Communities didn't just arise by agreement; that they were organic. It was more like an organism that you were part of. And so what the early sociologists, Auguste Comte, and then Durkheim was very influenced by Comte, what they were doing is saying, well, actually, if we're analyzing society and how societies are held together, what's important to people, it is, you know, the idea of the sacred is of crucial importance. This is something that Durkheim talks about. And looking at rituals and how they bring about community solidarity, looking at you know, at social connections as being important, families, small communities, rather than simply just large nation states and individuals. And so sociology was, in a sense, using a liberal epistemological framework to understand conservative subject matter, sacredness, authority, and these kinds of things. Now, they also always did have the notion, though, that they were trying to they're using the knowledge to improve society, right? So they were concerned about social breakdown and trying to understand, well, how do we organize societies where there isn't this social breakdown? How do we move into the modern age without societies crumbling? They had kind of these conservative instincts, though, with social order and those sorts of things, but always concerned with reform and those kind of things. So I think sociologists from the earliest days, even when they drew from conservative ideas, were sort of social reformers and liberal in that sense, and also in the sense of how do you arrive at knowledge. Now, so it's been the case, probably from the beginning that sociologists saw their knowledge as likely to improve society. And that's continued. I think along with just as I was talking before, they're just in other social sciences as well, in the universities as a whole, the ratio of left people on the left to people on the right has just increased, right? So it's always been the case that sociology was dominated by the left. It's even more so now, and I think that can then distort the research and stuff in certain ways, even when there's not just this explicit left-wing ideology, that it's going to affect research questions and how people answer them. So Christian Smith is a sociologist who recently wrote a book called The Sacred Project of American Sociology, and he was arguing basically that most, again, taking this idea of sacredness from Durkheim, right, that most sociologists see themselves as engaged in this kind of sacred project, that by doing sociology, and this includes people, the dominant people in the field who are doing various kinds of statistical analyses of surveys and other kinds of things. It's not just the far left activists, right? It's everyone almost in sociology who sees themselves as contributing to the project of reforming society. They see themselves as on the left, and society is progressing a certain way, and what they're doing is helping it do that, right? Some of them aren't going to be as extreme. Now, because of that, because they all see themselves as engaged in this kind of sacred project and on the left broadly, and that's what really sociology is doing here. That's our mission. Whether we're, if we're analyzing, female participation in the labor force, or wage gap between genders, or all these kinds of things, like we're doing good here. We're on the side of the angels, and we're helping society progress in a left-wing direction. That's not something that's questioned. Now, even though many of the activists, the people on the extreme left, actually will despise sort of the conventional sociology, right? They think it's not left enough for them, and it's conventional and stuff. But because but the dominant thing is still to see sociology as on the left. So I think many of those who are more mainstream would simply see the activist as, well, they're a little misguided. They're wrong that we're not, doing our part. We are, right? And but they don't. They're not. They're going to treat them with a certain kind of understanding that you wouldn't have if they didn't also see themselves as part of that sacred project, right? So they're thinking like, well, they're too extreme. They're not really being scientific enough. Maybe they make the discipline look bad. But still, we're all on the same page here in what we're progressing toward, right? And so, so how does so just extremely unscientific, ideological stuff end up prospering in sociology? How do we list in the book statements from American Sociological Association presidents and stuff like, even though it's not the dominant strain of sociology, these people who are very ideological get elected to these offices and stuff. And how does that happen? It's it's because that's what so many people see as sociology, some kind of left-wing vision, and so they may even so they so they may tolerate or even approve of even just the explicit ideological stuff, even if that's not what they're doing. I think so that's how I think sociology ends up embracing a lot of this and becoming a lot of times the intellectual source of victim culture.
Mm-hmm. Right. And would you say that perhaps another big incentive that lead people to adhere to victimhood culture or victimhood ideology in this case would be the fact that people obtain a lot of moral status, at least among the people that are part of the same class as them?
Yeah, I think it's one thing too. It's like it's broader than the universities themselves. So it is part of, I think, like elite culture in general. That's why it's spreading to corporations and these kinds of things. And I think that there is the idea again to to see if you're on the side of the good, you're you're associated with left-wing ideas just to some extent, and trying and demonstrating. It's almost like you can it's bizarre to me sometimes because I think like people who are doing pretty interesting work and scientific work, and you wonder like why why would they why wouldn't they speak out against nonsense, right? But I mean, I think there's this it's almost as if people see anything slightly to their right is sort of just reactionary, right? And things that are far to their left are simply maybe misguided, right? Or maybe too much too soon, right? So there's never any there's not a social penalty in the university environment and a lot of the environments people are in. There's not a social penalty for being too far to the left, right? Like, so I think, and there can be a social penalty for being on the right, and so you end up, I do think that's partly how things end up like this, and it simply reflects the fact that there are so few conservatives in academia, right? That everybody understands themselves. So many people understand themselves as not conservative, and if you're on the far left, then you're certainly demonstrating that.
Mm-hmm. And is there a good framework for us to look at victimhood culture and try to predict if it could have an important impact in society, particularly in the political realm, and if it could lead in the future, I don't know when or how, to sort of a tyrannical system just to try to correct for the things people that espouse victimhood culture see as societal problems.
Yes, this is one thing too. I think a lot of people might wonder, why is this, why do we care about what campus activists are doing, right? A lot of people kind of dismiss it like, oh yeah, and and also not recognizing that things have changed in recent years. They'll say, well, the campus activists were always nutty. It doesn't matter what they do. And they'll see it as just focusing on people who are on the fringes and on the extreme. There's also, so for one thing, it'd say like this is not as fringe as it was. I mean, for one thing, things have changed. Certainly in, as I mentioned, 2013 is when I first heard of a microaggression, but things moved fast. We wrote our article on microaggression and moral cultures in 2014, published it in 2014, and then at the end of 2014, in the fall of 2015, the campuses exploded. We think of these things as like these victimhood eruptions. So there was at Yale the issue with Nicholas Christakis and Erica Christakis. So Erica Christakis, they were the headmasters of Silliman College. So they're at Yale residential colleges. They'll have professors living there and supervising them. They're kind of headmaster. They were called masters. They've since changed the name to something else because master is offensive in the ideas that reminded people of slavery, right? But it itself an indication of this kind of culture dominating, right? But at the time they were still called masters. And Erica Christakis, one of the masters at college along with her husband, wrote an article and responding to a directive from the university about Halloween costumes. They were worried that people's Halloween costumes would be offensive. She writes an article, she writes an email to the college because they often have these kinds of discussions about stuff, just saying that maybe this isn't really an issue for the university. Maybe students could handle this themselves and talk to people or whatever. Students went nuts, vilified her and Nicholas, her husband. Nicholas Christakis is a very prominent sociologist, serving as this headmaster there, but a prominent professor at Yale, sociologist. They're both on the left too, Nicholas and Erica. So he was surrounded in a public area on campus by students yelling at him, screaming, cursing at him. Who the F hired you? All these sorts of things, and attacking them as racist and whatever, telling them to resign, demanding their resignation. They ended up resigning. That was one of the victimhood eruptions. There were others on campus at the time, and people wondering what's happening to our campuses. And I think it's the rise of victimhood culture that we're talking about. Why is it important, though? Is it still just some bizarre students on campus? It's not, because it's moving out of the circles of campus activists, not only being embraced by campus administrators and others on campus, but being embraced by people in the larger culture. There was some kind of panel that Howard Dean was on recently. Howard Dean, former Democratic Party chairman, candidate for president in 2004, but so a mainstream Democrat, a mainstream liberal. And he gave this long spiel, because they were talking about free speech on campus or something, defending the reaction against Erica and Nicholas Christakis, and actually lying about it, saying things that were completely false about the situation. But you think that, like, if this can happen at Yale and be prominent in the news and not be simply condemned by everybody in the mainstream, and you have people distorting it and praising it, people who are mainstream liberals, then I think that's an indication that this culture is expanding. Or the fact that university administrations have been embracing it, microaggression training sessions and other kinds of things. Prominent articles written arguing in the New York Times and elsewhere, arguing that speech can be violence and should be treated as such, right? So these ideas coming from campus activists, these ideas we've talked about of victimhood culture, being expressed in the mainstream, they're being embraced by corporations who now have microaggression training programs. I was talking to someone who works for NASA recently, and NASA has now training sessions about microaggressions. NASA, right? These are scientists, and And so it's moving and moving pretty rapidly beyond campuses. I think part of it too, what's happening more broadly in the culture and in politics is political polarization in the United States, and so the Trump presidency, the prominence of people on the alt-right make certain kinds of arguments too, and Trump and the reaction to that. You have a lot of people who are on the left who are embracing some pretty radical ideas that they wouldn't have before, but it's part of this polarization that, well, there's Trump over here doing this and that, and they're reacting and becoming more extreme themselves. So you're getting more extremism on the right, and you're getting more extremism on the left in American politics. Now at campuses, that it's just left extremism. There's there aren't enough conservatives for there to be right-wing extremism, right? But polarization in the broader society is a part of it. Now, what happens then if mainstream liberals begin embracing these ideas? I think that's something that could change things and move. So we have right now, there's a lot of controversy about the handling of rape cases on college campuses, and so there were directives during the Obama administration from the federal government for universities to investigate these cases, to try them, that they weren't doing enough to prevent rape on campus. And then if there is a Title IX offense, it's the law that governs what university campuses that receive federal funding can do. Then they had to change the one thing that is that they had to change the standard of evidence simply so that instead of something like preponderance of the evidence or that they would simply have to be where it had to be where the burden was still pretty much on the accuser to show that that a victimization had taken place, and now it's simply the case that if it's slightly more true that if it's slightly likely to be more true that the rape took place than not, then the rapist is punished. So they're kind of getting rid of ordinary due process, and it's not even just the standard of evidence. There's also like the fact that people have not been allowed to question the accuser and other kinds of things. So the standard of due process being eliminated on campuses. Now that's controversial. A lot of people have criticized this and said that it ends up people, innocent men, being kicked out of college and those kinds of things. The defense is always, though, is off. If people are defending it, is to say, well, these aren't criminal penalties, right? But the logic of it, I think, certainly from the far left activists, is that they should be, right? And I think when you see assertions that that women should always be believed, right? And it's less like from the campus activists, it's less that there really is this distinction where the law should really be different, and it's more like, well, we can't do this in the criminal justice system yet, but we do have this power on campuses, and you can easily imagine bringing these kinds of standards to the criminal justice system, and other kinds of things. And if that happens, or take the free speech issue, their argument is that certain kinds of ideas are in fact hate speech, which should be banned. Now, under the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution currently by the courts, there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. There are other kinds of exceptions, like about defamation and obscenity and other kinds of things that can be banned. But the First Amendment in the United States guarantees free speech. The government can't censor speech, and that includes anything called hate speech, right? That's not an exception. They're arguing that hate speech should be something that can be censored, right? And that which in itself might not seem as problematic. I mean, there are lots of countries that don't have the same kind of free speech protections as the United States do, that where hate speech can be banned and things like this. They're not totalitarian societies, or at least not yet. But you combine that idea that hate speech should be banned, and you're thinking of hate speech at first as the Ku Klux Klan or some, the Nazis denigrating minorities and calling for violence against them and things like that. But when you combine this with the idea that they think that sort of ordinary conservative ideas are hate speech, that and attempting to censor campus speakers, and then you end up with the idea that that you could simply censor conservative ideas. Now you're going kind of against basic free speech ideas that are necessary in a democracy, right? If we're going to have elections and we're going to have political debates, then if anything should never be touched, it would be political disagreement, political argument. But that's kind of where many of the extreme activists would like to move us, right? Would like to censor any, so it would be like, we can think about the things that they've declared are microaggressions, for instance. The University of California had a list of possible microaggressions. They were using in a faculty training thing, and some of the examples of microaggression were things, like, I believe the most qualified person should get the job, or, and so it's like essentially a disagreement with race-based affirmative action, which is an ordinary political view, and a very common one. And identifying that as some kind of microaggression, and then again you get the idea, well, it's an aggression, it's harming people. Or the idea, another one was America is a melting pot. This is something that's been said in the United States for years. The idea, it was actually always a celebration of diversity. The idea was that people, immigrants had come from all over the world and created this common culture. But it's offensive to many of the modern activists because it's saying, like, you should give up your old culture, right? It's a melting pot. We melt together instead of being distinct. And so they saw like America is a melting pot as a microaggression. Well, if these are the kinds of things that they think are a kind of violence, even if it's a little bit of violence, and then they also, and it's violence, not speech. They want, they don't believe that that speech that harms minorities, which they say is what this is, should be protected. It should be called hate speech. Then you are looking at something that looks very totalitarian. No due process rights, based on your group membership, right? And are you an oppressor group or a victim group? You get certain rights if you are a victim and not if you're an oppressor. Or speech, you can say certain things or not. That does begin to look very totalitarian and anti-democratic. Those are the goals of many of those who embrace victimhood culture. Whether they can be realized and against opposition is another thing, and that's unclear as of now. What's a little disturbing is the political polarization I mentioned means that ends up being extremism on both sides, and it may just be a matter of who's in power at the moment, right? And rather than having a common, middle and a moderate culture that would value things like free speech and due process, it would be like each side simply like waiting to suppress the other, and that's that's something that if we end up getting, it's not just about dignity culture, it's about reactions to it and to other things on the right as well. But it's a situation that can be very threatening to liberal democracy.
Mhm. Yeah, and you talked about the fact that people even would like to censor other people just for the fact that they are conservative. And putting aside things, more superficial things like race and gender and sexual orientation, it could turn into a very discriminatory thing in the sense that, as we know from the work, you already talked a little bit about that come from people like Jonathan Haidt, the political leaning is something that is temperamental. So, I mean, people lean to the left or the right according to something that is part of them that is even biological. So, even in the strictly political sense, that from that point of view, it should be, or it would be very discriminatory, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's correct. It's interesting when you see a lot of the debates around these issues, and you'll see, like, a lot of the I mean, I see all kinds of things on Twitter coming from all sides, and there's an idea that is somewhat true, that you can hold people responsible, for their beliefs, like you can for their actions, and not for like immutable characteristics like race or sex. That and I do agree that that's different. I mean, it is very different in the sense, like, for example, you should be able, and again, free speech thing, you should be able to criticize people's beliefs, condemn them, all kinds of things like that. But there isn't just kind of an absolute line where yeah, it's sort of this is why we have free speech and other kinds of things that limit what you can do. I mean, it's part of the reason is that we have, I mean, in general, this kind of the idea of, that part of the reason we have free speech is that we respect people's consciences, right? And we don't, in any kind of society, you have to make restrictions on people's behavior, but letting them express the ideas that they have is not something that something we've decided we don't need to limit, and part of the reason is that people actually can't just change their ideas. People often do when they're convinced, but if I believe something, then I believe it, right? It's not something that we can simply legislate. So you'd be suppressing it. As you note, also, if we really want to, we use kind of as a, as a general moral framework, we hold people responsible for things that they could change about themselves and not they couldn't. But really, it's our beliefs and our ideas about things are often sort of resulting from our hardwiring, from our upbringing, even, but things that, again, that we don't really have control over once we're at some kind of stage. I think this is something. So one of the things about the victimhood framework is, as I was saying before, it only analyzes things in terms of oppression, and so and only certain kinds of oppression, right? So there's not, they are concerned with disabilities, so that's something that sometimes comes up, the disabled or disadvantaged in a way that others aren't, but just in terms of understanding, like, that there's neurodiversity, that things differently, interact differently, have different beliefs about things, and that's always going to be the case. That there can't, even no matter what the political range of political views is, how left or right it is, right? There are still people on the right and still people on the left, right? Like in whatever society, which is so again, like if you're going to censor one side, it doesn't work to have you don't have a free society. I think also some people have written about how you know, a lot of the conflicts that people that you have in victimhood culture result from neurodiversity and things like that. So you may have someone who actually is sort of insensitive and engages in more of the things that people call microaggressions, not just the where are you from kind of things, but or you know, America's a melting pot. But I mean, I mean, some of the other things that they've listed. I mean, some of the list of microaggressions have some pretty you know, rude things or offensive things, like, you know, someone asking, like, you know, you have say you have someone who has a child of a different race, and you know, ask them, well, are you the real mother? Right? That's the kind of thing that really is bad manners and impolite and stuff. But it's also the case that with neurodiversity, there will be people who are less attuned with cultural norms like that, about conversations, about what you ask and what you don't ask, and what kind of ideas you express when, right? Because a lot of them are subtleties, and even about even with some of the sexual harassment issues and stuff, right, where you're talking about things that are subtle and not things that are clear rules. Like, we can obviously say, yes, don't grope someone, right? But when is a joke, right? Making someone uncomfortable and creating a hostile environment, or you know, when is asking for someone a date acceptable or not? What about standing too close to someone? How close are you supposed to stand? These are things that most people understand intuitively, and many of the people who are violating them understand them as well and mean to violate them, but not necessarily, right? And again, so you can try to set up a situation where there are clear rules that people know to violate or not, but then you're missing a lot of the subtleties. There are, you know, people are slighted all the time, and people are, you know, harassed in very subtle ways. But are we able to deal with that, you know, without without disadvantaging people who won't understand it intuitively, and you know, and also giving an advantage. You give an advantage to some people and say that anything they perceive, any of their perceptions are correct and will be acted on. You also give them a weapon to punish people they simply want to punish. So these are, some of these are complicated issues. I think that I mean, a lot of the stuff we talk about, you know, is I mean, like banning speakers from campus. These are, I mean, those are I think issues that I think are clear, right? We don't, or chasing out Brett Weinstein from Evergreen State College, or you know, surrounding Nicholas Christakis and yelling slurs at him. Those are kind of the manifestations that seem most offensive. But some of the things, you know, especially when you're talking about sexual harassment issues and other kinds of just like, what kind of environment do we want to create? You do get into complicated issues of how do we balance things against each other. You know, we don't want people subject to harassment, to, you know, slurs and things constantly. We don't want the experience of minorities to be to be more difficult than for others on a college campus or elsewhere. But it becomes very hard to deal with these things in anything but a very informal way, because there are so many subtleties involved, and without also then disadvantaging other people. Are you disadvantaging people who don't get those kinds of subtleties that people, because of neurodiversity or whatever else it is?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just perhaps one last question, because I think it's very important for people to really understand this well. That is, we've been focusing a lot on the leftist, let's say, manifestations of victimhood culture, but victimhood culture also has its set of manifestations on the right? And perhaps one good example of it would be the alt-right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even in our original article 2014, we mentioned that we talked about conservatives embracing certain aspects of victimhood culture too. Certainly on the campuses, there are a few conservatives, so it's not as big an issue. But a lot of them were embracing, like they would, I mentioned before, victimhood culture is a matter of degree. So anytime victimhood becomes a kind of status, there's to some extent victimhood culture there. And we saw, like, you'd see some conservatives often in reaction to the left saying, well, no, now they're the victims. Or you get in, this is something that social psychologists have called competitive victimhood, is that often in moral disputes, you get people arguing over who's the victim, right? It's like, I'm the real victim here. And so that can either take the place of either just kind of trying to, dismiss the whole worldview by showing, yes, that, there's lots of victimhood here too. There was an article by a student at Princeton, I think, Tal Fortgang, that we talked about, who, he was responding to the idea that people should check their privilege. Activists were telling people who they think have privilege, check your privilege. And he is, a white man, but he pointed out that, his family members had fled from Nazis and people had died and all this kind of stuff, just showing, like, if you go back, like, there's oppression in his family too. But not that there's necessarily anything wrong with him doing that as an illustration, but it does show a kind of, it's a strategy of, rather than saying, like, oh, this stuff doesn't matter, it's just, it's saying, no, well, no, I have all this victimization here, give, me some moral status too. You also then get conservatives, talking about, conservatives being banned from campus and other kinds of victimizations there, and they're often real, but then saying, well, we're the real victims, and you get this kind of competitive victimhood. I think then there's two possible reactions to victimhood culture from the right, and they overlap sometimes too, even though they're a little conceptually distinct. There are two possible reactions that are departures from dignity culture, right? So one possible reaction is just to maintain the old dignity culture. But the others are, one of them is what I've been mentioning, embracing victimhood yourself, like we're the victims. The other is embracing a kind of offensiveness and saying, embracing oppression itself, and almost adopting the worldview of the left, but being on the side of the oppressors, which is what the alt-right is doing, right? They're saying, oh, we see that, in other words, so a lot of the left will see the world, in terms of, like racial oppression, one group oppressing the other, and the alt-right then will say, yes, that's how the world works, and we have to look out for our own race, and it's, or at the very least, they're embracing identity politics, right? The idea that it's your identity as a member of a group that's important. I think, like, people like, Richard Spencer, a white nationalist, somebody on the alt-right who's become more prominent. He's been, I'd have to look exactly, but he's written things like this, saying that, oh, the left is often right about this and this, but coming to completely different conclusions. So it's almost like, embracing oppression, to a lesser extent when you're not talking about the actual alt-right, but just people on the right in American politics. There has been, like, an embrace of so they'll talk, one of the things we talk about are trigger warnings, right? The idea, that people can, triggers for PTSD are real things, but the way it's been used is to kind of assume that, again, all these kinds of, that there are all kinds of people out who are likely to be triggered by oppressive words or something. And you'll see people on the right kind of, talking about triggering the liberals or triggering the activists, like we want to trigger them, right, and using this. And so embracing, like, just things that just as if offending them becomes the goal, right? in a dignity culture, it's not just that you're not supposed to be quick to take offense. You're also not supposed to deliberately offend others, right? Because you don't because you have dignity, you don't need to care what others think about you. But because others have dignity, you don't need to insult them, and you need to be polite to them. And so there's that rejection of dignity from that angle too, to say that basically we're going to to be as offensive as possible. And you see some of that coming from Trump and support for Trump. A lot of it is like just it has other causes, I'm sure too, but a lot of it is a reaction to the victimhood stuff on campus, saying, if these people are so hypersensitive, let's just go ahead and offend them, right? And also, as I said, there's an overlap between the two things too. We're the real victims, or we're just going to be offensive, or maybe even oppressive. And you can actually argue both, even though they may seem like contradictions too. But that often happens with moral views, and I think that's something that we haven't written about as much because we're writing about college campuses, and this is more in the broader society. But it's not. But yeah, we don't make any argument that conservatives are immune either to victimhood culture or that they're necessarily paragons of dignity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Campbell, just before we finish here, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can follow your work on the internet, perhaps your social media, and also, I don't know if you want to share with people perhaps some interesting piece of work you're doing right now?
Okay, so you can, so one thing, the book is The Rise of Victimhood Culture. You can get that on Amazon. We also have a blog called The Victimhood Report, which you can find at www.victimhoodculture. Victimhoodculture.com, right? So www.victimhoodculture.com, and it's called the Victimhood Report. We blog there occasionally about things related to the book, things that are happening, different things we want to write about that are related to it. New offenses that pop up. I mean, we haven't talked about today cultural appropriation, but like a microaggression and other things. We're constantly seeing new offenses and applied to new things, right? So we kind of wanted to have the blog to, so we can kind of, keep commenting on different things that pop up. We think that the victimhood culture is, the victimhood culture we write about, we keep seeing it becoming more prominent. So you can follow work there. I'm on Twitter. Campbell Sociprof, S-O-C Prof. Campbell Sociprof is my Twitter handle, or you can look me up in some way. Jason Manning, my co-author on the book, is also on Twitter. Social Geometer is his handle. So coming from the idea that we're looking at social geometry as explaining things, like the kind of social structure. So he's at Social Geometer. So you can find us there on Twitter or on the blog. Right now we're continuing to talk about this and to write write some other pieces on it. We're also we also work on other things. So this started as a side project because we just got interested in what was happening with microaggression. We're already interested in morality, but I'd written things on genocide. I have a book on genocide. Jason Manning has written stuff on suicide and is currently completing a book on suicide with University of Virginia Press. So we're kind of also a little back to our old stuff, but continuing to think about this and to think about morality sociologically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so please don't end the call after I finish the recording, because I would just like to have a quick word with you, please. And anyway, Dr. Campbell, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, KARIN, LIETZCKE, and then BLANCHETTE. Thank you for all.